Some 3,500 years ago, two women walked into a room. Though they had not been in this particular room before, they'd been in many rooms like it. A few other women were gathered, sisters and mothers and daughters, and there at the center of their attention was the woman in labor. Perhaps pacing and rubbing her lower back, perhaps already kneeling on the birthing stool, ready to begin delivery. The two women we're interested in today quickly got to work, their hands moving almost mechanically to prepare a blanket and a basin of water, wiping the sweat from the brow of the soon-to-be mother, quietly taking command of the efforts of those gathered to assist with the birth. And after some time, maybe just a few minutes and maybe many hours, our two women, Shiphrah and Puah, gently hand the new baby boy to his mother. And in doing so, they violated the law of the land. Pharaoh had ordered all baby boys born to Hebrew women be put to death. But Shiphrah and Puah's hearts were on fire, and so they quietly and gracefully did what they were sure was right. Roughly 3,000 years later and 6,000 miles away, another woman walked into another room. This room was right here in Rochester, a barber shop in the 8th Ward. This room was full of men who were shocked by the arrival of our woman. Ignoring their surprise and consternation, our woman, Susan Brownell Anthony, boldly approached their table and cast her ballot for President of the United States. And in doing so, she violated the law of the land. Women wouldn't earn the right to vote until 1920, 48 years in the future. But Susan's heart was on fire, and so she quietly and gracefully did what she was sure was right. Susan B. Anthony, a woman of the 19th century who made us more equal in the 20th, effortlessly joins us today in the 21st, where we find that she is as relevant to our lives today as she was to her enormous following in her own lifetime. It's tempting to think of the women's rights movement as one that lives only in our history books. And yet recent news of so-called locker room talk, or the fact that women make only 78 cents on the dollar compared to men, or the reality that women are disproportionately represented among victims of abuse make clear that, while certainly progress has been made, there is still plenty of work to be done. And so today, as we continue our series of sermons on local dream weavers, we take a moment to turn our attention to the stories of three remarkable women: the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and the suffragist, Susan B. Anthony. First, the latter. Susan B. Anthony was born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. There were only 23 states at that time, and their union was threatened by the South's practice of slavery. Throughout her life, Susan would point out that another type of bondage was practiced in every state in the Union, North and South alike. Just as slaves belong to their masters, she would say, so do women belong to their husbands. A married woman in America could not own property, earn money, or be guardian of her own children. No woman could attend college. There were not even women's colleges at the time, and only a handful of professions were open to women: housework, sewing, teaching, factory work. Then, as today, women took home a fraction of the pay earned by men, and, of course, women had no right to vote. Susan's family was close, and her parents nurtured in her and her siblings a passion for social justice that was only heightened when the family moved to Rochester in 1845. This city was a center of political activism, with an especially strong emphasis on the need to abolish slavery. Susan's mother always encouraged her to go and do all the good she could. Her father hosted abolitionists' meetings every Sunday at their home and encouraged Susan's full participation, which is where she met her dear and lifelong friend, Frederick Douglass. Susan also became active in the temperance movement and was particularly concerned about the abuse alcoholic husbands committed against their wives. It was this issue that led her to what would become the passion of her life. She realized that without legal rights to money or property or children, women were helpless to leave their husbands. And she understood that legal rights would never be fully achieved without the right to vote. Susan had found her calling, a calling confirmed in her friendships with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. She began to attend women's rights conventions and to travel as a speaker around New York State and beyond, where her natural proclivity for public speaking and exhortation became clear. She wrote letters and pamphlets, lobbied lawmakers, and befriended women and men working for justice. And her actions rippled out to change the world. We know much less about our Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, than we do about Susan B. Anthony. The midwives are allotted only a few verses in the Exodus story, and we often skip over those to focus on what happens next: the baby Moses bundled into a basket and sent down a river to be pulled up by Pharaoh's daughter to become the leader of the Hebrew people. And yet the story of these two women with hearts on fire, these two women who help bring new life into a broken world, their story echoes through the centuries to speak to us today. A new Pharaoh had arisen over Egypt, a king who doesn't know or hold respect for Joseph and his people. This new Pharaoh is threatened because the Hebrew people are multiplying, and no amount of state-sanctioned slavery can hold them back. Pharaoh spreads lies to his Egyptian people that these Hebrew immigrants are a threat to be feared, and he does everything in his power to drive them to the fringes of society. And yet none of his efforts succeed. And so Pharaoh adopts even more drastic measures, as so often happens when we let our fear of others drive our national policy. Pharaoh orders that all baby boys born to Hebrew women be put to death. The midwives are told to carry out these orders to kill baby boys and allow baby girls to live. But, says Exodus, the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. Shiphrah and Puah put their trust in God rather than in Pharaoh, and they knew that their God was God of life. They knew that their calling was to help bring life into the world, literally. So they simply do what they know to be right, and their actions ripple out to change the world. It's ironic that Pharaoh only orders Hebrew boys to be killed, because it is a series of women who will finally be Pharaoh's undoing. The midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Moses' mother and sister who make sure the baby boy escapes to survive into adulthood. Pharaoh's own daughter, who pulls Moses from the river and claims him as her son. These women, overlooked by the powerful man driven by fear, these women follow God's call to seek after and honor life. And friends, that is a calling we all share. At the center of our faith is God's gift of life, and our call as disciples is to bear that gift into the world. When we see life, true life around us, we are called to pick it up and carry it to those in need of God's precious gift. And when we find ourselves in places of deep darkness, where life does not seem possible, we are called to be midwives and laborers, helping the life God promises be born into the world. It's possible, perhaps even likely, that Shiphrah and Puah didn't live long enough to see Moses grow up to lead God's people out of Egypt. And Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, 34 years after she cast her ballot, and yet still 14 years before the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote would be ratified. Often in our calling to seek after God's promise of life, we don't get to see the fruits of our labor. We are called to seek after life not because it will be of benefit to us, but because it will be of benefit to the world. In every moment, in every action, and in every interaction, we are given opportunities to seek after life, to bear God's promise of life into this broken world, and every moment matters. Friends, the things we do this week, the things we do today, our actions, our decisions, our choices, will ripple out with consequences foreseen and unforeseen, for good or for ill, for the health or damage of the world. The question isn't whether we will make a difference, but what. What will we do this week? What will we do today to make a difference in the world? Friends, this calling is not simple, and it is not easy. But thanks be to God, we are not alone. In her last public address given the week that she died, Susan B. Anthony put it this way: "There have been others also, just as true and devoted to the cause. I wish I could name every one. But with such women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible. May it be so. Thanks be to God. Amen."